Today, we are going to talk about the Adventist Church's problematic relationship with sex and all of the related things that surround that, which it's a lot of things. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that I had some trouble this week putting this presentation together is that it feels like there's so much. It was hard to get it down. And so if at times the presentation feels a little scattered, like we're going in this direction and then we're going in that direction, and it's like that because there's just too much to cover. But we're gonna go ahead and do our best. And honestly, I told Lauren yesterday that I'm the least interested in this presentation part. I'm the most interested in the discussion that's going to happen afterwards. So that's the part I'm really looking forward to. But here we go. Let's go ahead and get started. We are going to start with Dr. Renee Bergstrom. Dr. Renee Bergstrom was 3 years old when her mother was concerned that she was having masturbatory behaviors and took her to an Adventist doctor who removed her clitoris in 1947. And she says in her own words, you can look her up. She has articles, interviews, lots of things. You can see her story. In her words, she says, this is something that we very often associate with African or Muslim cultures, but this happened to her in 1947 in white Midwest America. And it was this procedure, as well as other similar procedures, such as the one where we spoke about in the article about acid being applied to female genitalia, was endorsed by, advocated for, and performed by an Adventist doctor in order to curb masturbatory behaviors. So she describes in her interviews and in her articles the daily pain that she experienced the majority of her life. She had really horrific childbirth experiences because the scar tissue that she had doesn't stretch like healthy skin. And so there were operations performed on her against her will, and all this terrible stuff happened to her. She is now an artist, doctor, and advocate for women who have experienced female genital mutilation, FGM. And this is one example of Adventist longtime problems with sex and gender issues. This is one of the horrific horror stories. This is one that we were able to access easily because of the public way that she has come out and advocated for herself and for others who have experienced this kind of thing. And she uses her education and her experience to work with other women who have had this experience. And she's a remarkable woman. Honestly, I was very impressed by her when I read her story. But her story is just an illustration of one of the ways that the Adventist Church just has got it not just a little bit wrong, but a horrifically, awfully, terribly wrong about this particular issue. And some of the things that we believe still about sex are influenced by these former attitudes that were so damaging. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And sort of like Lauren said earlier, this is going to be an honest discussion about sex, biology, gender, and Adventism. I am not going to be vulgar as I speak, and I ask that you also not be vulgar when we have our discussion time. But we will be talking about adult things, and this topic is uncomfortable, and it makes people upset, and it makes people nervous. So we're all just going to practice taking deep breaths, using our self-control, and having an adult discussion about an adult topic. So why did this come up so soon in the church? Our early church founders, our Seventh-day Adventist church founders, Ellen and James White, and the other people involved in the founding of our church, they were very focused on their belief that Jesus was coming, in 1844, October 22. So they were They were happy. Ellen White writes that it was one of the happiest times of her life. They were so happy. They were about to experience Jesus coming back, and they were so wholly focused on that. Um, and so there was this kind of attitude that, like, let's just put sex aside. It's kind of like not important to our mission. And yet church members kept getting married, even when there was this expectation and uh, these ideas about Jesus coming soon. And then John Martin wrote this tract. I don't believe that he was Adventist. I believe that he was some other type of Christian, but his tract about the heinous sin of self-pollution or masturbation um, was so influential that it influenced like a huge amount of people in his time. And some of the people that were influenced by his tract were early Adventist founders. And so the things that he said in his tract about how horrible masturbation was and how bad it was for you and what a sin it was, the early church founders were hugely influenced by this. So the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences in both sexes considered with spiritual and physical advice to those who have already injured themselves by this abominable practice, and seasonable admonition to the youth of the nation of both sexes. So this was published in 1708, so it was that time period. So as a result of this tract, James and Ellen White also had some pretty out there stuff to say about masturbation and sex. And Lauren and I talked about this pretty extensively, and we agreed that Ellen and James White actually had some pretty sensible things to say about sex and masturbation also. So it's kind of a mixed bag with them. You can find stuff that's like, really, this is totally wild. And then you can find other stuff that's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And that's a pretty sensible thing to say. So we did want to make sure that we were balanced in that approach. This is not like an attack on James and Ellen White. It is just an acknowledgement that some of the things that they said about sex were really far out there and also harmful to our attitudes about masturbation and sex and the way that we have approached this topic in subsequent generations. So let's take a look at it. Ellen warned of licentiousness or lust, certainly can be seen in some porn users today. Warned about forced sex in marriage. That's one of the sensible things, and actually very ahead of their time that they said. For a long time in the United States of America, if you were married and you claimed that you had been raped by your spouse, the courts would throw it out. You can't be raped by your spouse. And so the fact that James and Ellen White were saying already at this early stage that, forcing your spouse to have sex with you, which is essentially rape, is not a good thing. We should not be doing that. That's something very sensible, very good that they said that was ahead of their time. They also warned against ministers misusing their authority, which we have seen over and over and over and over in churches. We have seen in the Adventist church, but in other churches too, all over the place. It seems to be like a endemic in churches. People in power, clergy, there's this abuse happening. And so they said all those years back, many who profess to be ministers of Christ are like the sons of Eli, who ministered in the sacred office and took advantage of their office to engage in crime and commit adultery. So again, really sensible things, but then on the other hand, not so sensible things. So let's take a look at some of the more ridiculous things that were said. Ellen White's description of the harm to those who practiced self-pleasure listed imbecility, dwarfed forms, crippled limbs, misshapen heads, deformity of every description, as well as cancer. Now, we know all of those things to be total nonsense and have nothing to do with, anything to do with masturbation at all. And Ellen White had a frequent habit of blaming women for tempting men. So there was a lot of misogyny. We're going to call it internalized misogyny that she had there, where she was saying that, in cases of adultery, there was like this temptress figure. And the blame tended to land solely on the woman in those cases rather than and there was an equal partnership involved in this sin, but for Ellen White, there was frequently in her writings a certain blame that fell on the woman. Then we get to John Harvey Kellogg, and if you're Adventist and you know anything about John Harvey Kellogg, you already know what I'm going to say. John Harvey Kellogg was like obsessed with masturbation and sex. He was really out there. He was in fact so out there that I believe that the early Adventist church eventually disfellowshipped him because his ideas were really crazy. So he was obsessed with masturbation. A quote from him: "The sin of self-pollution, which is generally considered to be that of Onan, is one of the most destructive evils ever practiced by fallen man. In many respects, it is several degrees worse than common whoredom and has in its train more awful consequences. He recommended circumcision without anesthetic, believing that the pain would prevent masturbatory activity. Sewing the foreskin shut with silver wires, which would cause pain with any erection, and the application of carbolic acid to the clitoris as an excellent means of allaying the abnormal excitement." So yes, pretty horrific things happening there. As late as the 1960s, there was a doctor named Harold Shryock, who was a dean of Loma Linda University, and he practiced and recommended female circumcision. So he said there are teenage girls who, impelled by an unwholesome curiosity or by the example of unscrupulous girlfriends, have fallen into the habit of manipulating these sensitive tissues as a means of excitement. This habit is spoken of as masturbation. There is an anatomical factor that sometimes causes irritation about the clitoris and thus encourages a manipulation of the delicate reproductive organs. Oftentimes, the remedy for this situation consists of a minor surgical operation spoken of as circumcision. This operation is not hazardous and is much to be preferred to allowing the condition of irritation to continue. So this is happening in the United States as late as the 1960s. So this is some pretty awful, pretty horrible stuff. Yeah, I was just checking the chat box for a second to see it. I usually, when I train, I can like have more of a back and forth. I don't like this lecture style as much. I like hearing how people are responding to what I'm talking about. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So how has this played out in the church? Well, there are a lot of consequences to this type of attitude. And we have focused on masturbation thus far, but all of the ideas about premarital sex, and marriage, headship theology, all of these things are kind of entangled up together, which is why we just had so much to cover in this presentation. So how is it played out in the church? Well, we still hold some pretty extreme views on premarital sex. A rejection of those who fell to temptation, especially girls. Like, understand that this type of I want to say discrimination against people who have fallen to the temptation of premarital sex. The women and girls are the ones who bear the brunt of that, not only because of misogyny, but also because women and girls are far more likely to experience consequences, which in this case, we're talking about the consequence of pregnancy. And there have been many, many, many cases in which pregnant women have been rejected or forced out of the church, expelled from schools or boarding schools or day schools. But the men or the boys involved in this practice had no consequence whatsoever, which has been really awful. Then we have purity culture. I have spoken and written extensively about purity culture in the past. It's really harmful. I could talk about it way too long, so I'm just gonna like set that one aside a little bit. Adultery demanded in order to justify divorce. So, if there's abuse happening, emotional abuse, or even if people are just horribly, horribly miserable being married to each other, like they can't get divorced unless someone has had sex first, right? Like somebody, and there have even been times when church leaders like asked couples who were getting divorced, like, which one of you had sex? Which one of you had adultery, right? And then after the divorce, which one of them had sex first so that this divorce could be valid in the eyes of God? Just really, really terrible stuff here. Then religious teachings on masturbation still officially held. There's never been any retraction of those kinds of wild ideas about masturbation. Continued reluctance to talk about sex, which is why, both Lauren and I felt like we needed to have a lot of disclaimers at the beginning of this talk. We don't talk about this topic publicly very much. Occasionally we talk about, in very small groups, but it's not talked about openly or explicitly very often in a public place like we are today. Then we already have talked about the wholesale rejection of LGBT people. Last week at the ATSS, we talked about Colin Cook. And if you missed that presentation, it is now up on the website, and you should definitely go back and watch it because it's really just such a historical event, such an important historical event that happened in the Adventist church, and something that we should not be sweeping under the rug. We should be saying what happened and admitting what happened and apologizing for what happened and using that information to inform us as we move forward. And then Wayne Blakely is a more modern example of how our church has still not learned this lesson from the Colin Cook affair. Then reluctance to deal with sexual offenses among male pastors and teachers. You have probably heard many times about pastors who had some type of sexual indiscretion or abuse, and they didn't get removed. They just got shuffled to a different conference and they pastored over there. And some pastors have been shuffled from conference to conference to conference to conference, and the abuse keeps happening. And many times the abuse keeps happening and the church doesn't know what to do, so they promote the pastor. They promote him from out of pastorship into like a conference position because they don't want him abusing people anymore. That's not the right way to be dealing with this. Then we still have women mostly blamed for tempting men. And then the discouraging of women of beautifying themselves. This is part of the purity culture piece, right? Like controlling how women appear. We want to make sure that they're not wearing yoga pants and they're not wearing spaghetti straps, or, they're not showing their belly, because we wouldn't want to do any of those things. It might tempt the men. And so that's a piece that we have talked about previously, that purity culture piece, controlling how women appear in order to curb the lusts of men, which is, again, not the right way to deal with the lusts of men or the lust of anyone, to be frank about that. So what are some of the things that we got told? Well, I can tell you some of the things I got told when I was a kid, the lies I was told about sex. So one of them was, if you're a virgin and you get married, God will bless your marriage bed and you'll have the most amazing sex ever. Definitely not true. And I know I'm not the only one to have experienced this. Also, if you don't want to burn with lust, you should just get married. And we're going to talk more extensively about that in a minute. But yeah, if you don't want to burn with lust, you should get married, which is causing young people to get married at an extremely young age. A woman who is responsible for the sexual satisfaction of her husband, if he is unsatisfied, even to the point of having an affair or using pornography or cheating on her or whatever, it's her responsibility because she hasn't satisfied him enough. Also, sex isn't really for women. It's really for men, right? Like, it's her job to satisfy him. How do we know that sex is over? Well, he's done. So that must mean that we're done. That's kind of the idea that is taught to young people in the church. A woman should be sexually available to her husband at any time and in any way he wants. It doesn't matter if she doesn't want it. It's her responsibility as a married woman to take care of him anytime he needs, anytime he wants. No decision needs to be made on her part. And then, of course, we still have the lingering masturbation is bad and wrong and will ruin you for your marriage bed. So we have sexism and abuse inherent in the sex message. So just like we've talked about headship theology and how headship theology sets us up for abuse. This particular piece of headship theology, the idea that women being satisfied by sex isn't really important. It's important that the man is satisfied, and that women should always be sexually available, and that women are responsible for the sexual satisfaction of their husband. So if he is somehow unsatisfied sexually and therefore cheating on her or something, it's somehow her responsibility for that. That is really, it's misogyny is what it is. It's really sexism in the cloak of theology. And when we espouse headship theology and this nonsense about women being responsible to satisfy men sexually, we are just asking for abuse. We are putting men and women in a position where men hold all the power, and that is a recipe for abuse. We already know, I mean, there's a saying that we know, right? Like power corrupts and ultimate power is ultimate corruption. I'm saying it wrong, but like that idea is in this scenario. When you set a man and woman up in a relationship to believe that the men have all of the power and the women have none, then what you are doing is setting them up for abuse and unhappiness. And that is the exact opposite of what we should be doing for young people when they're trying to make relationships work in their life. So do women have to submit to sex? So I was like, I could answer this easily. No, no, they don't. That is an old idea, and it needs to die, because it has bad consequences, a lot of dire consequences for the way that both women and men conduct themselves in relationships. So culturally, women tend to get shamed for sex, whereas men get praised, right? And you can see this isn't just a church thing, this is a cultural thing. Women are often called sluts, or they're called easy, or they get around, right? Like the idea of shaming women for being sexual, whereas men tend to be like, oh yeah, did you get her? High five, right? Like in our culture, there is this imbalance between men and women, and the reaction of society to having sexual experiences. Biologically, we talked about this already, women are the ones who tend to suffer the consequences of pregnancy, and therefore women are the ones who are most visible for having sinned, right? And so women receive the brunt of the punishment. Even if it is clear to everyone who is the male participant in this pregnancy, he tends to not suffer as many or any consequences for having had premarital sex, and women are the ones who take the brunt of it. And then I believe that healthy relationships mean sex should be enthusiastic and consensual for all parties involved every single time. Consent can't happen when there's no choice. So if a woman feels that she has to be sexually available to her husband at all times for any reason, and she is responsible for the sexual satisfaction of her husband, then she does not have any meaningful choice. And if a woman has no meaningful choice, then she cannot consent, because consent means I can say no. And if I do not have the choice to say no, then I cannot consent. And that is just not a healthy way to have a relationship. It is baffling to me that people think that could possibly be healthy in a relationship. So how are relationships? This is similar. Despite what the church teaches, the thing that makes sex special isn't that you've only experienced it with one person. So this is something many people have, even people who have followed the rules of the church, have had possibilities of having sex with more than one person in their life. That's one of the things that the church teaches us, that if two people get together and they're the only ones who've experienced sex together, then that makes their sex very special and perfect and intimate. But that isn't really the thing. I mean, people who have had a spouse die and gotten remarried, people who have gotten divorced and remarried, people who have had premarital sex and then got married. There are many ways that people have experienced life and discovered that being two virgins getting married and having sex together isn't the only way that people can experience the beauty and the intimacy that sex can offer. The thing that makes sex special is breaking down those power barriers between people and being emotionally vulnerable one person to another. And so this idea that sex can only be special if it's with one person only ever for your whole life, is not true. It's not the thing that makes sex special. The thing that makes sex special is the intimacy that you share, the vulnerability that you have between two people, and the closeness of two souls together. And then I put at the end here, there are also many people who have only had sex with one person in their entire life, and it's been a not great, not intimate experience for them. So the idea that this is the only thing that can bring intimacy and sexual satisfaction is not true and harmful to people. So pressuring young people to get married early to satisfy lust. This is something that really bothers me. Um, when we tell young people that they have to wait until they're married to have sex, and if they are burning with lust, then they should just get married. What we are doing is we are causing people to get married too early. They are they are getting married at like 20, 22, sometimes younger, 19. My grandma was married when she was 16. It's too young. Um, it sets young people up for abuse, unhappiness, and divorce. Sexual problems are the #2 cause of divorce in America. The #1 cause of divorce is money. So, we're not going to get into the money discussion, but the fact that sexual problems are the #2 cause of divorce should tell us something. Like, we are not doing a very good job of helping people understand how to be sexual with one another in a healthy way, in a way that will be satisfying for all parties involved. Sexual compatibility is important to a marriage, and we tend to just gloss over that in our teachings. And I do want to ask the church in general, why would we want our children to rush into marriage too early just to satisfy their natural sexual urges? Did you know who you were and what you wanted from yourself and from your partner when you were 22 years old? I know I didn't. And I feel like it is unfair for us to expect that our young people will know who they are, what they want, and what they want in a partner. And also, when I was 22, I didn't know how to spot red flags in relationships. I didn't know how to spot danger in relationships. I didn't even know, uh, well, any of those things. And so when we pressure young people into getting married at this young age, we are just setting them up for heartbreak and divorce, because we're making bad matches because they're being pressured into getting together just to satisfy lust, which honestly is a terrible reason to get married. We should be teaching our young people to get married because they are compatible, because they share values, because they love each other, not because they want to satisfy lust. So every study ever done shows that young people are going to have sex regardless of what we teach them. This is an unpopular thing to say to churches because a lot of times churches want to teach abstinence only education in churches, but every time studies are done on the subject, it shows that young people are going to have sex. They are. We can teach them and teach them and teach them, but it is going to happen. So when we teach them how to have sex safely and we don't shame them, what we are doing is we are teaching them the difference between safe, healthy sex and unsafe, shame-filled sex. When we can offer them easy access and affordable birth control combined with comprehensive sexual education, we can reduce some of the inevitable consequences that have happened to young people in the past. I'm not up here saying like, yes, let's send our children out to have sex. Woohoo, sex is great for young people. What I am saying is that this is going to happen, and the way we are dealing with it is not helpful. It's not useful, and it's hurting people. It's hurting our young people. So if I want my young people to be safe and healthy in their relationships and in their sex life, then I am going to give them easy and affordable access to birth control, talk to them a lot about sex, comprehensive sexual education, so that they are prepared, so that they can be safer and protect themselves from the types of consequences that people have faced in the past. We should be, I'm saying we should loosen up our attitude a little bit, accepting that young people are going to have sex before they get married, and that shaming, judging, and turning them away when that happens isn't working. It is hurting them. Lots of us have made mistakes and gotten divorced, and let's stop slamming the door in their faces. So Lauren, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something quickly? No? Okay.
Actually, no, I didn't have my hand up, Lindsey. I was clapping for what you were saying.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool. I didn't
It,
recognize that emoji.
yeah, yeah. I'm really very, I'm really excited about how honest and how clearly you're giving us all of this. Thank you.
So marriage and divorce is another issue that is related to this issue that keeps coming up. And I know that I admit that I am biased as a divorced woman. I am biased about this, but telling people that they have to stay in marriages that are abusive or harmful or marriages that make them miserable, many pastors and church members have told people that they have to stay, that they have no choice. And that is just such an unhealthy attitude. I wish we could stop telling people that. I wish we could stop telling people that they have to give up happiness in their life in order to live up to this theological ideal. Attitudes toward divorce were not only shaped by Jesus' words, but also shaped by misogynistic attitudes toward women. If keeping women helpless and dependent is necessary for the institution of marriage, this is something that I hear sometimes. Occasionally, someone will come out and say something like, since the feminist movement, women have been able to get bank accounts and jobs and credit cards, and they don't even need men anymore. And it's causing this big divorce problem. And every time I hear that, it like boggles my mind. Like, keeping women helpless and dependent is the way that we make marriage work, then we need to rethink marriage, right? Like, making women feel like they have no choice but to stay with someone that they feel miserable with is not the answer to the divorce problem. This idea that we have a nuclear family, mom, dad, kids, that idea is actually a very recent addition to world history. If you look back through world history, even in the Bible, you can see many other variations of the way that families have worked throughout history that don't necessarily have father, mother, children as the nuclear family. And so this idea that like we must protect the nuclear family, this is a really new idea in the history of the world. And it's other cultures too. You can talk to anthropologists, talk to historians, and talk to theologians. The Bible does not contain only that type of marriage. The Bible contains many, many, many different types of families. And the Bible doesn't necessarily have a value judgment for them. And so the value judgments that we place on those families are ones that we have placed on them, not ones that the Bible explicitly places. So then we have LGBTQ. And this is, again, something that we have at Adventist Today already talked about extensively. But when we are rethinking our attitudes about sex, that necessarily means we need to rethink our attitude about LGBTQ people. Because the way that we have dealt with LGBTQ people, which is like rejecting, condemning, and even now in our modern world, persecuting and literally killing LGBTQ people. And Randy was mentioning earlier the legislation that is coming out in America right now about trans people and trans kids specifically it makes me so angry. I can hardly speak. I'm like so upset about it. It is so not okay the way that our country is treating trans people today. It has terrible consequences. So not just in our culture, but in our church too. The way we have dealt with LGBTQ people has had very bad consequences. And one of the bad consequences, in addition to all of the stuff we've talked about, the way it affects LGBTQ people specifically, is that we are losing members like water. They are running out of our church because the way we have treated LGBTQ people is just not in line with the way that we are thinking about this anymore. We have to rethink this issue and we have to do better because this is so bad the way we have done this. The suicide rates are up, mental health struggles are up in LGBTQ communities, marriages falling apart because one of the partners isn't straight and can't feel intimacy with their spouse. And then the Colin Cook disaster, which was talked about last week. the abuses and horrific things that were happening, and the church has still not apologized for that, and neither has it learned its lesson, as we see from the Wayne Blakely stuff. So the Colin Cook and Wayne Blakely gay change idea, and then we talked earlier, if you weren't here at the beginning, Lauren was sharing about how upsetting it is, this Uganda death penalty and life imprisonment thing for LGBTQ plus people, and then the church leaders' complete silence on the issue. Here they are, like, punishing and pressuring and censuring us for wanting to ordain women, but when we want to literally kill gay people, it's like, we don't have anything to say about that. We have nothing to say on the issue. It's so upsetting. And then we got Pastor Sasha. You probably followed that saga. Uh, Pastor Sasha is a pastor who came out as gay to his congregation, and the conference decided to keep him on, but then there was some talk about possibly not keeping him on, and then I think the decision was made that he can continue pastoring, but he's receiving a lot of pressure, and the conference is receiving a lot of pressure, and this is a big deal problem that we are dealing with in the church right now. And you know, I think we've gotten it all wrong, and we need to change how we think about this.
Lindsey, uh, Pastor Sasha's conference president who went to bat for him has been on the chat today. So a little later, we want to engage him and find out what the latest is with Pastor Sasha.
Yeah, I would love to hear the latest update on that. And I don't know what your name is, but the fact that you went to bat for him is wonderful. I wish we had more people with your courage.
Dennis Meyer, friend of mine
Yeah.
who I admire greatly. And Dennis is on here today, so we'll engage him a little bit later. I really think very highly of Dennis and of Pastor Sasha too. Sorry to interrupt you.
So the fact that we continue to hold uncompromising hardline attitudes on the issue of sex, LGBTQ people, masturbation, divorce, these things are hurting people. This is causing real harm to people right now, and it's causing harm to individual people, and it is also causing harm to the church. We have to change how we think about this. We are losing young people, and you know, every time I say young people in an Adventist Today setting, someone will say not just young people, and they're right. It's not just young people that are leaving the church over these things. This is important stuff, and the more we bury our head in the sand on this, the more people we're going to lose. And it is continuing to cause divorce and heartbreak. And abuse by clergy, we mentioned earlier, the church is still not dealing with clergy sexual abuse. There are still cases where women aren't being believed and pastors are simply being shuffled on to another place instead of dealt with the way they should be. Hope for Survivors still regularly gets reports of young women who have been abused by Adventist pastors. The good news is that there is some small changing of attitudes. It takes a long time. A church as large as the Adventist Church is going to take a long time to move forward on these issues. So I do admit that, even though I feel a lot of frustration, I do admit that there are some things that are changing. So here are some examples. In some congregations, couples who are unmarried or LGBT couples who are living together, for example, are accepted. People just don't talk about it. It just doesn't get brought up, right? We just pretend like it's not happening, which is not ideal. I would much prefer to see more of an embracing and accepting attitude, but we are at least seeing tiny baby steps in the right direction, so that's encouraging a little bit. In some congregations, divorce and remarriage are not dealt with as rigidly as it has in the past, so that is also a step in the right direction. Many more progressive Adventists are supporting LGBTQ people, and I would like to believe that Adventist Today has something to do with that, because we are very publicly and very, I like to think, persuasively letting people know that this is an issue we need to deal with, and we need to deal with it now. And there is a new document from the North American Division. It may not be what we hope for, but again, baby steps in the right direction. They are in that document recognizing that there is a difference between orientation and behavior. I talked to Lauren about this a little bit yesterday when we were preparing, and I was like, it feels frustrating to me. This is like 20 years ago stuff, but we are moving in the right direction. So okay, we will celebrate the small steps, even if we are frustrated that the step isn't bigger. And some churches are starting to give baby showers for single teen mothers. I've seen churches starting to do that, and that is something that I appreciate, because I do remember vividly as a child, um, teen mothers being rejected from the church, and told that they're sinful. All right, so we're almost to the good part. We're almost to the part where we get to discuss. So here are some things that I would like us to think about as we discuss. How have your attitudes changed about sex in your lifetime? I know my attitudes have changed dramatically about sex in my lifetime, and I imagine it's the same for many of you. Do you have LGBTQ people in your family or among your friends? And how would you like them to be treated by the church and by the culture? And as you look at how divorce has been handled in the past, what can we do to be more welcoming and kind to divorced people? How can we show more support for young people who have different attitudes about sex than we do? And have you ever seen a pregnant teen be rejected by a church? And what can we do differently for her now? So those are some of the things that I'd like us to think about as we have our discussion. I'm with trepidation. I'm going to pull up the chat and see what everybody's talking about.
I told Lindsey a story yesterday when I first started ministry. One of the prominent church members was accused of having a divorce. I wasn't even ordained yet, of having an affair rather, and that he and his wife were getting a divorce. And I struggled to know quite how to handle it. And my conference president said, "Well, you're going to have to go do some detective work." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You should go sit outside their house and see who comes and goes." I refused. I didn't do it. And I almost didn't get ordained by this conference president. But I mean, isn't that shocking? I just said no. If I can't ask him some questions and leave it at that, um, there's no more that I can do. So I've had some astonishing experiences, particularly in the area of divorce and remarriage as a pastor. It's been very problematic, and some of you are divorced and have been remarried, and you probably can share some of those stories too. Um, by the way, the book that I need to say a little bit about Harold Shryock and why he was quoted there. Some of you know that Harold Shryock was actually the dean of the Loma Linda University Medical School. So this is not some unknown, you know, little person off to the side who's talking about female genital mutilation. This was a major Seventh-day Adventist figure, and the book that he wrote was one of the best-selling books of all time for Seventh-day Adventists, called Unbecoming a Woman. And some of you, I know, were given that book and probably read it. And there was another book that went with it called Unbecoming a Man that was equally frightening, but he did not recommend the sorts of things that he did for the women. Let's just face it, folks, some of the stuff that came up back then, and I know it was a different era, I want to be understanding, but it was totally barbaric.